All right, we
Afraid
already
my hat doesn't get the focus here.
Oh,
It's
no.
okay. All right, it's okay. Kind of goes in and out. That's how I roll as a wizard.
Yeah, you know, it's not about fashion if you're a wizard.
That's right.
All right. Welcome, folks. Muggles, as you shall be referred to. All right, for those who have already joined, I launched a poll. Hopefully you are able to see that. For just a quick answer on what type of auth you're working with right now so that we might have an idea of what you might want to cover. Ooh, and it's complicated. Yikes. Love seeing people roll in. We'll give it a couple more minutes and we'll kick it off. Looks like we have a split with it's complicated being the most common answer thus far for authentication. All right, this is looking good with 10 attendees. That's awesome. Very exciting. Well, thank you all for joining. We're very excited to have this very wizardry webinar office hours for you. If you haven't attended one of these before, just to give you a little context, we are trying to make sure that we are just connecting with our customers and answering some of those kind of hot topics. So each month we'll have a new topic to cover, and we'll send out a little bit of information. So next month we will be talking about our beta for the GitHub onboarding. So if you haven't heard about that, get ready to see some banners in your StackHawk platform, because we'll be looking for signups, and we'll be sending out information on those office hours in the coming weeks. But today, welcome to the wonderful world of authentication. Our wizards today are, of course, the fabulous Wizard Potter, who will be walking you through the various chamber of secrets around all of the StackHawk integration authentication methods. We also have Wizard Zach, who will be representing Ravenclaw and here to answer any questions that are in his field of expertise, and a Gryffindor representative, Mr. Wizard Kevin, and I, representing House Slytherin, will be your host. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Wizard Potter, but just so you know, there is a Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom feel free to ask any questions along the way. Raise your hand if there's something that you need to have specifically answered, or if you want to talk, I can let you pop in since we don't have a huge crowd. Feel free to just jump in with a question when you have it. All right, Wizard Potter, take it away.
Fantastic, Lindsay. Thanks. And folks, Lindsay wanted to make sure that you knew that I have my owl familiar. It's right here, but can't hold them up and type at the same time. One of the common problems of wizardry. So let's jump in here as part of just the prepared presentation. I've got a couple of slides to kind of set the context, and then we'll jump in and showcase a couple of different methodologies for authentication, and then we can definitely field questions throughout, or jump into your individual scenarios. And we're really trying to maybe develop a bit of a community around StackHawk where we can facilitate getting our customers talking to each other about common scenarios that they're encountering. So feel free to use this time that way. All right, so when we're talking about auth-NZ, as it's often called in the security world, meaning authentication, which is proving your identity, versus authorization, which is how you validate your right to resources and bypass access controls. And we're talking about security testing. There's really kind of two different perspectives that people have in mind. So I want to just sort of disambiguate these two. Number one, sometimes we talk about how do I test auth-NZ directly? How do I validate that my auth flow is secure? How do I test that my access controls are implemented properly? A lot of vulnerabilities in this space are related to what's called IDORs or BOLAs, insecure direct object reference, or broken object level authorization. Those two are basically the same thing. In different contexts, you might hear one term or another. And that's essentially like if you have a multi-user environment or a multi-tenant environment, can one user improperly access something that another user owns or controls? And this was the #1 API vulnerability on the OWASP API top 10 starting in 2021. However, the challenge with automating testing of IDORs or BOLAs is that they're almost always extremely business logic specific. So you have some application that implements some business logic, and the access controls around that is very difficult to write a generic test case that will test these types or test for these types. There has to be some execution of your specific business logic and some validation that you and your developers understand for your application in order to identify these. So we're not going to dig into these a lot today. I just kind of wanted to cover that as one thing that a lot of people are concerned about. The way that StackHawk covers these today is that we provide you with the ability to write custom logic tests using JavaScript or Kotlin. We have a super simplified example in a blog out on StackHawk.com that shows you how to write like an IDOR type test case. And of course, you have to implement it using your own business logic. You can register that. I've included some doc links down here about writing custom test scripts, and we can share these slides afterwards. It's just a couple of slides. So we're going to set that aside for a minute. The other scenario is how do we test or automate testing through authorization in order to access those access controlled endpoints and really get a deep and thorough test of your application or your API. So StackHawk has implemented a very robust authentication engine. Also hat tip to OAuth Zap, of course, which is our underlying engine. And we've built out some capabilities on top of that that can help you do very robust authenticated testing. We've got several different types, HTTP and NTLM, which in many ways behave similarly. Form-based, JSON-based, where really JSON is just a form-based where you're pinging an API endpoint with a JSON body instead of, a form URL encoded body. External, which is actually really, really useful, and we'll cover it in a little more detail today because it can allow you to leverage engineering resources that you may have already developed in-house, in order to grab a testing token or something like that. And then, of course, script-based authentication, which allows you to fully customize your auth flow using a Turing-complete language. And if we have time, we'll take a look at that today as well. On the authorization side, we support cookies, we support headers, we support a combination of cookies and headers, and you can also write an authorization or session management script and sort of have full control over how that works. Within the YAML, we've got a number of test automation controls for authentication, and I'll talk about a couple of these in more detail on the next slide, but that includes test path, logged in and out indicators, the anti-cross-site request forgery parameter, and include exclude paths, but particularly in this context, exclude paths comes into play because you can tell the scanner to avoid any application or API endpoint that is going to cause a logout, and that's really useful in order to get scans without a lot of disruption caused by needing to re-authenticate. So let's talk about kind of some principles of automated authenticated testing. And some of this content was borrowed from a relatively recent blog post by Simon Bennett, the founder of the OAuth Zap project. But number one is StackHawk provides you with a very unique ability within the DAST space to test in lower environments. So traditionally, and sometimes I'm a classic security guy, we often think about coming in the front door, testing from the internet because we want to see like what's exposed. But in terms of like genuinely getting to fixes of vulnerabilities and helping drive culture change in our organization so that developers are owning their own problems, we want them to be able to test in development environments. And typically, one of the benefits that this provides is that typically in lower stage environments, the auth is much simpler because you don't have to implement MFA in order to be secure because those environments are never facing the internet. And typically, developers would just work around that if you did try to enforce that on them because it impedes their velocity. And that's really the number one driver today of a lot of concerns about application development is how fast can we go? How fast can we get features out the door? And StackHawk can assist in this by allowing you to test in lower environments where the auth has been simplified. So you avoid all of the infrastructure that you might have to deal with, and you can just use a simple form or grab a token using a test script or something like that. So leverage that to your advantage. The second point I want to talk about here is the test path section, which you can see at the very bottom of the screenshot on the right. And this is essentially a unit test for StackHawk authentication, right? And so we really want to leverage this in order to fail rapidly if needed, so that we can implement an authentication scheme And then if it doesn't work, we don't want the scanner to just proceed as if nothing's wrong and give us crap results, right? So the test path allows us to set up a little unit test that quickly checks if authentication is working right, and then fails fast if it doesn't, and gives you some meaningful output so that you can begin to iterate on that and get a working authentication. A lot of people haven't had an opportunity to dig into kind of the complexity of the config that's available with test path. But you can really construct some significant scenarios, including posting to endpoints with bodies, JSON or regular URL encoded bodies. You can test on success, you can test on failure. There's a lot of options around the test path that you can create a unit test that makes sense for your application logic. Quickly, logged in, logged out indicators, which you can see at the top of the screenshot, are Java regex, the Java engine regexes that allow you to specify how the scanner is going to identify if it is still fully authorized to your application or API, or if it needs to reauth. And so, one of the benefits here is if you do have a classic app, which is typically easier to use with these, or if you have an API where there's a very consistent pattern when the JWT token, for instance, is no longer valid, you can set those up using regexes. The scanner will check on every response to see if it matches one of those criteria. And if it does, it will auto re-authenticate so that you're never stuck going through a scan where the auth breaks, 10 messages in, and then you don't know any better until you get to the end. And then, of course, always a good idea to avoid the logout endpoint or anything that would have that effect. And so you can set that up using exclude paths. All right, that's really the end of the slide deck. We really came here for a live demo. So let me jump over to my IDE and show you some of what we've got set up. So the first thing that I want to demonstrate is how we can use the external or injected auth in order to leverage existing maybe engineering artifacts within your development environment. And we've recently made some changes to this external auth to make it a lot more robust and allow you to do multiple tokens and cookies. So let me show you, first of all, so let's suppose that this simple script is an existing engineering artifact that I have. It just goes out and grabs a token from my API endpoint. And that could be on the same domain as my test application, or it could be on a completely different domain. In this case, you can see I'm running a curl post command to this endpoint to sign in. I'm passing a JSON string that includes the username and password. So I have the content type set to application JSON. And then I'm extracting, using JQ, which is a common Linux Mac command line utility to work with JSON structured data to extract the token value. And so if I run this script from the command line here, it's going to hit my API endpoint and give me back a JWT. Now, one of the cool things that I can do in order to leverage that artifact with StackHawk is, let me just go ahead and I'm going to create an environment variable based on calling that script. So it's going to take the output of that script and then assign it to the auth token environment variable. And I'll just echo that back so you can see it. Now that this is in the runtime terminal environment, I can leverage it in my StackHawk configuration. So if we take a look at, I've actually got this particular config broken up into different layers, but here we can see I'm using the external authentication type. I'm going to use a token, and this value string is actually abstracted to represent that environment variable, which it will pull in from the environment at runtime. And so since I've specified this as auth token and that matches auth token, we can see the token authorization is telling StackHawk how to pass that token back to the target application. In this case, we're going to pass it as a header. The header name is authorization, and we're also going to prepend bearer. So very classic authorization bearer token authorization style. And so if I run this Hawk scan and I give it a couple of YAML layers here to include both the baseline one that I've defined as well as this external JWT one that we're just looking at. You'll notice the test path is also set up to hit an API endpoint and then check on success of the status code. So that's going to go ahead. Let's wait for a moment, make sure that that scan is actually going to run, that our authentication has worked. All right, this right here is the output of that test path unit test. Once we did the authentication, which in this case was just grabbing the external token and then adding it to the header, it made a call to this test, to this endpoint, and then tested against that regex that I provided to make a very quick check if authentication is valid. And then because it did pass, it jumped right into running a scan. So while that scan is running, let's pause for a moment, see if there's any questions, and then we will pivot into looking at kind of the opposite end of complexity, where we can write a fully custom script, and we'll basically just take the exact same scenario for simplicity's sake, but hopefully you'll be able to see the power that's available with the scripting engine. So do we have any questions?
So far, we have no questions, but just if you do, feel free to use the little hand raise option and I can unmute you if there's anyone in the list that has a question.
Awesome, guys. All right, so let's take a look at this same scenario where we're going to reach out to an API endpoint, possibly of some arbitrary host that is not associated with our application under target. Maybe you've got microservices and the auth microservice is on a different domain than your target API, and so you need to make a call across domains. That would be a great place to use a very simple script to do that, and get back the token, and then you want to add it back into your header, for instance, and use it against the test app going forward. Let me pull up a different IDE just because it's got better coloration for our code inspection. And actually, let me jump over and show you what our StackHawk configuration looks like first, and then we'll jump into that. All right, so here we've got a StackHawk configuration file that is doing a very similar thing. We can see the authentication here. The type is script. That means that it's going to execute the script that we specify. And whatever that script returns is going to be handed off to the authorization section of the YAML. In this case, I've defined a script called JSONauth.kts, meaning it's a Kotlin script. And we'll walk through that in just a second. We've defined a section where we're going to pass some variables from the YAML configuration into the script. Two sections. One is credentials. And the difference between these is that anything in the credentials section automatically and always gets redacted. So you can pass in sensitive like test credentials here. They'll always get redacted on the client side. They never get sent over the wire except to the application itself. And then general parameters, which maybe are a lot less sensitive. In this case, I've defined a base URL so that we can have a little flexibility if we need to define, like a different domain than our test app. And then a login path. In this case, it's going to point to that same API endpoint that we were using previously. What we're going to get back from that, of course, is that JSON body that has several parameters at a top level. The token extraction section here is going to extract the value of the token. And this value field will actually take JSON dot notation or JQ dot notation. If you have your JWT that's buried, wow, that was super cool. Lindsay just kind of like disappeared. That was very magical, Lindsay.
So staged.
That's fantastic. Sorry, guys, a little squirrely
right,
moment there for me.
I dipped into the hollows for a second.
Yes.
The dogs were getting restless.
If you can't tell, we really have a lot of fun working at StackHawk. So, and then the token authorization is going to do the exact same thing that it did in the previous config, where we're going to take that token value, that JWT value that we extract, add it back in as an authorization bearer header and pass it back. And then the test path is also identical. It's going to hit that API endpoint, and then it's going to test against the regex of the status code. So really the major difference here is this section, well, including the extraction. And so let's take a look at this script and see what's going on with it. This is where I'll pull up my IntelliJ because the code coloration is better. We've got some standard imports here. And by the way, if you're not familiar, out on GitHub in the StackHawk Kaka repo, we have a bunch of HawkScan scripting examples and templates that you can use for some common scenarios, mostly oriented around third-party OAuth providers. Also, we can definitely help you get started if you have some, scenarios that you need to script out. We can talk to you about those and help you figure out how to get started. And we also provide, although it's a little bit of a hidden feature, we do have an SDK that you can install in your IDE in order to get code completion for HawkScan scripting. So right here at the top of the script, I've just set up some constant variables that are going to have the same string names as the parameters and the credentials fields that are in the StackHawk YAML. The way that scripting works in StackHawk is that every script type implements a contract. So it implements a Java interface that represents a contract between the main scanning engine and the script. And that means that we have to implement some specific functions with a specific signature. In this case, we have an authenticate function, and it has a very specific signature, both parameters that it takes in and return type. For an authentication script, this is the main entry point. So in kind of standard programming parlance, you would think of this as main. It's where the script is going to begin to execute. And then, of course, we can have whatever logic we want within that. We can define other functions outside of that if we want to refactor and kind of keep things clean and discrete. There's a couple of other required functions as part of that contract implementation, including get required params names. This tells us what our parameters are that we're going to get from the configuration file. Get credentials params names is similar. It defines the credential parameters that we're going to get from the config file. You've also got an optional params, which we haven't defined any of those for this particular script, but you could define them, and that would make them, you could either enable them in the config or leave them blank, and it would work in either case. Version 2 of the auth script contract also includes functions for you to define programmatically get logged in indicators and get logged out indicators. And so that adds a whole new level of power to define, determining whether or not you're actually authenticated to your application correctly. So you can go far beyond simple regexes and actually implement custom logic. All right, now this is a really simple script, and it's basically captured in that one screenshot right there. So we've got some logging that we set up. We establish the target URL, which is based on that base URL value combined with the login path. And then we set up a message right there, and there is the headers. So we specify that it's going to be content type application JSON, that it's going to be a post, that it's going to be HTTP version 1.1. And of course, it includes the URL, which comes from that target URL variable that we just created. Then we very simply create the body. In this case, we want it to be formatted in a standard JSON string format. So we've got a couple of data items here, the username, and then this pulls that value of the username from the config, and then the password. And similarly, this pulls the value of that password parameter from the config. And in all of the logging, those will get auto redacted. Then we put everything together. We add a length header because it is a post. And then we send and receive the message. And then these two lines of, down here just log the outgoing and the inbound message. And then we return the message to the scanning engine itself, which can then take actions on the content of that message, which is what we do. So pretty straightforward. Obviously, it will look a little Greek if you've never dealt with ZAP or HawkScan scripting before, but we can usually walk you through kind of getting started with that using some of our templates. And of course, if we jump back over to our test scenario here, I have this script JSON YAML set up to use that script. And so if we come down here and we run a scan, using that particular configuration, we'll see something very similar to what happened with the external inject. That's really the wrap on the formal presentation for today, but we're happy to dive into anything that we presented, as well as anything that is of interest to the folks on the call. And even if it has nothing to do with authentication, really. So, next 30 minutes is yours to just ask questions about whatever you want. And anytime they're hard, we'll refer them to Zach.
I just opened it up, so if all you have to do is unmute if there is any question that you have. I know Jonathan asked a question in the Q&A, which Zach answered, but Jonathan, do you have any follow-up questions on that or anything that you want to just bring up here? He asked, when we perform the authenticated scan, do we have to declare the routes that we are going to scan, or does StackHawk do the discovery automatically?
Yeah.
No, it's okay with the answer. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Yeah, just to summarize that, we have phases of the scan, and the first phase is always to authenticate. Well, first phase is to check the config and make sure it's valid, and then we authenticate, and if that succeeds, then we'll go through discovery. And so all of the discovery phase happens in an authenticated state.
Do we want to add any color on the types of discovery that we do?
It's a
Just-
great idea. Got
Yeah,
a ton of different methods.
so many options.
I was going to ask, and this might be a nice dovetail, I was going to ask Eric if he could show the documentation that we have on this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. That's I think you were magically reading my mind. All right, so StackHawk Docs at docs.stackhawk.com. If we're specifically talking about discovery, that's an application thing. So it's going to be like intelligence about your application is going to be under the Hawk Scan main menu item. And we can come down here, so you can see there's a whole section on authenticated scanning, which is a lot of what we just covered. And then scan discovery is down here with its own section, because that operates really independently. And you can see that there's several different options here with base spider, which is like a Google style crawler. There's an Ajax spider, which is informally kind of deprecated. I mean, it still absolutely works, and it's not been formally marked deprecated, but we have better methods that can leverage your existing engineering suites and artifacts that you've already created. So the Ajax spider is kind of older technology. It's not as deterministic or as comprehensive as some of our newer methods. Sometimes it's the only thing that works. But if we've got some stuff to use, for instance, custom scan discovery, or to use open API configuration or GraphQL introspection, that's going to be much more robust than using the Ajax scanner. Let me just show you real quick, like some of the custom scan discovery stuff. And I'll just show an example with Postman here, but it goes far beyond Postman collections. A lot of people use Postman to test their APIs. And so they may already have a Postman collection that defines their entire API and has custom test data and defined API calls. Well, StackHawk can leverage that existing engineering artifact in order to comprehend your API and build out a route tree before conducting security-specific testing against it. And you can see here we add a little section to the StackHawk YAML that can define the Postman config, including like a file path if you've done an export, and a few other optional parameters there. And then StackHawk will actually execute your Postman collection, and then proxy all of that traffic in order to understand what your routes look like. And we've got a number of other test suites that we can interoperate with, including quite easily Cypress, Selenium, Playwright, Python scripts, pretty much anything that we can add a proxy to. We can leverage your existing artifacts to do discovery.
And I will just shamelessly plug the optimization panel, which we just released. So if you're wondering if your scans did take advantage of some of these, whether it's the API specs or these other scan discovery options, just have a look at the panel in the scan details, and you can find out what you might be missing that could be helping you out to get those scans a little bit more optimized.
Yeah, and Ryan asked in the Q&A if we're using OpenAPI or Postman collection custom scan discovery, will StackHawk still try to enumerate other parameters that might not be part of the spec? And the answer is, Ryan, that it depends. It depends on how you've configured the discovery section of your YAML. So if we're looking at this example right here on the screen, right now, we have intentionally set the base spider to false, which is going to turn that spider off. So we just want to use the Postman artifacts to discover the API. However, by default, the base spider is set to true. And so if you don't define this line, it will still engage the base spider and try and discover other routes or endpoints that it can spider to that may be outside what's defined in your API spec or your Postman collection. So general best practice is to set base to false unless you want that behavior explicitly, in which case you can leave it at the default.
I actually did have a question just to confirm with what you were saying. So you're saying if you have Spider enabled, it will act in combination with the other discovery that you have set up, or is it acting in place of?
It will act in combination.
Okay, thank you.
They're all additive.
And I think some of that, the toggle around those things too, can really affect the speed of your scan. So it's worth playing around with just to make sure that you get what you expect, all your paths and the speed that you need.
Speaking
Really great. Yeah, go ahead, Zach.
I was going to say, speaking of parameters, our OpenAPI scanning or discovery method is really robust and has some features that are pretty cool. Can you talk to those a little bit?
Sure. So the first thing I've changed screens here to point at the OpenAPI configuration docs. And so we can see just like super simple way to get started is to specify if you have a dynamic endpoint on your application that exposes your JSON or your YAML, you can specify a route in the StackHawk config. And in fact, I move my Zoom controls. Hold on. Let me show you an example in our test application here. So this is our test app, and if I go to the OpenAPI endpoint, right, it defines the YAML or the JSON that defines the API that represents the backend on this application. So just doing that dynamically, or you may have that file downloaded in a local instance or part of your repository where it's being maintained. So you can also point at a local file. So all of that's pretty standard. I think what Zach wants to get at is that this relatively new custom variable injection, and this allows you to define custom data that you want to have injected into your API. It's it's becoming very common today to parameterize API routes as you define them. So for instance, maybe you have an application ID or a user ID or an account number, and a particular API endpoint won't even resolve unless it has a real value as part of the route. And for traditional DAS, that has been a major blocker, and so folks will say that they can test your API, but essentially they just get back a long string of 404 responses because none of the endpoints are actually resolving to real business logic. So we've implemented a method that you can get around that challenge and actually define the fields that you parameterize in your API, and then provide StackHawk with custom data that it will use to populate those fields so that you get real resolution and you actually get to the point where you're actually scanning your business logic. And in fact, we've recently made an update to this, and you can now actually define fields. So previously in our first iteration, if you had multiple different fields within your API spec that had the same name, sometimes that's the case because like there's a base route, and then you expect that the business logic of the application is going to understand what type of app ID or account ID or group ID needs to go into a specific route. We didn't have the ability to differentiate between those two, but now we do. So you can actually specify a path and know that this particular search text field is only going to apply to parameterization on this specific path. And then, this particular search text field and the associated data values will apply to parameterization on this path. And so you can split those out. It's a much more sophisticated solution that allows you a lot of fine-grained control about where your custom data gets injected. Did you want me to touch on anything else with this, Zach?
No, that's pretty good. Although the smart values is kind of an interesting subject too. I haven't seen a lot of people actually use it.
That's true. We've not seen a lot of people use this, but one of the things that we have done kind of on top of what I just described is, let's say you don't have existing test data, but you know that you need a value somewhere that is properly formatted. We have created a connection with the standard Faker library, which is often used to generate suites of test data. And so you can specify using the Faker library when you implement like this custom test data pull, and actually have StackHawk generate fake data that is properly formatted for your use case. So we support a whole bunch of the default formats within the Faker library, including email formats, phone numbers, UUIDs, and a lot of other ones. As you can see down here, we've got a whole bunch, including Yoda quotes. Hey, Lindsay, we need to go back to product and make sure that they add like Harry Potter spell names and quotes in there as well.
I'll make sure that it is a feature request that I add.
Yeah, exactly.
Consider it done. Shall be done. All right, Matt has a question. Can you point? Actually, Matt, do you want to just unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Can you guys point us to the IDE SDK that you mentioned for auto completion? I couldn't find that.
For sure. So there's maybe two different things that are a little bit conflated in your question. And that's because we did talk about two different types of files. So one type of file that we talk about is the StackHawk configuration, which is a .yml or YAML file. And that schema is published at schemastore.org, which is just an open source collection of a lot of different configuration formats that all use more or less an IAC, infrastructure as code paradigm. And ours is included in that. If you're working in VS Code or Visual Studio, and you install the Red Hat developed YAML plugin, that will give you a connection to schemastor.org and allow you to get auto completion hints in your configuration YAMLs. The other piece that we talked about is that SDK that you mentioned, where we actually have all of our jars, and you can get code completion assistance. That's actually a zip file download from the StackHawk site. And I think if one of you guys could grab an example of that and dump it in. Did you put it in chat already?
Yeah, I'm going to drop it in chat here, a little incantation.
And we can add all of these links to the presentation that we'll send out. So
for sure. Yeah, so that one's a zip file download, and you can install it as like a supporting module in your IDE. I can show you what that looks like if we go over here to IntelliJ and look at like my file project structure. It will open this up, and under dependencies, I have identified that HawkScript SDK. We release a new version of this every time we release a version of HawkScript. You know, most of the time there's not major changes from one version to the next, but it'll always be in the same kind of location that Zach's going to share with you in chat.
Yeah, so I posted a couple endpoints in chat. The first one is where you can get that current HawkScan version, what is the latest. And then if you can, oh, my paste didn't work out super well, but you can see I kind of doubled up the link to the SDK zip file itself, but just modify that link to include the current version of HawkScan that you're using. And then the final link, the SDK setup video, is a walkthrough on how to get that configured in IntelliJ for your project.
Great, thank you guys.
Super cool.
awesome. We have another question from Ryan. Would you like to ask your question live, or would you like me to read it out?
Yeah, read it out.
All right. For the Faker integration, will StackHawk only send data formatted in the specified format, or will it also try to test input validation on those endpoints in addition to following the formatting rules? And Ryan just took a big bite of his salad, so we got you covered. There's also a lot of Ryans, so
yeah,
love it.
Cool, great question, Ryan. StackHawk will do both. So typically when we're talking the custom data injection, we're talking about populating those parameters in your API routes. And that is a little bit different than, say, you get to a valid endpoint and you need to submit a post with some data in the body. But StackHawk will do both. It will both use the data format that you specify in order to get to the valid endpoint, and then both in the parameter as well as in the data required for the endpoint itself, it will try and do injections.
Hopefully that answered your question. Yes, we got a thanks. Awesome.
Also, what kind of salad are you eating? It's getting to be lunchtime here, and I'm starting to get hungry.
Some homemade concoction of chicken, black beans, and a bunch of lettuce.
Yeah, nice. Unfortunately, I think it's Golapagot's third law or something like that. You can't create food from nothing. So I'm going to have to go up to the kitchen and actually figure out something to eat.
Now, what kind of wizard are you? Jeez.
No, that's one of the rules of the wizarding world. You can't create food from nothing.
Oh,
Yeah, it's sad.
it's sad. That would be like one of the superpowers that I would want as a wizard.
Exactly.
All right, any other questions? Well, as many of you know, we have Slack channels. If you have follow-up questions, feel free to ping us there. If you don't have a Slack channel with us, feel free to email us. We will send out the deck and the recording so you have access to all of this. And we really appreciate your participation. This is awesome, such a great crowd. And we hope to see you next month. Remember, we will be pitching our GitHub onboarding beta. If you'd like to sign up, feel free to also ping me in the Slack channels or shoot me an email. We will happily get you added to our list to beta that out in the coming weeks. And also, last thing, if you're going to be at Black Hat, don't forget to stop by our booth and say hello. I think Zach will be there. And a couple of other folks from our team, and we'd love to see you. Go get another t-shirt if you don't already have one, or 4, they're a hot commodity.
Might have some beer koozies or something too.
Oh my, and nobody wants those didn't go like hotcakes at our last conference. All right, well, thank you, Eric. Thank you, other wizards. Thank you to the muggles who joined. Austin would like to have 4 shirts. There are many styles, so Austin, we can make some of that happen for you. Okay, I think we're done.
Great, guys. Thanks for the discussion.
Awesome. Thanks, team.
Good call.
Bye.
Good
Kick
call.
off.